532, 533, 534, 535, 536, 537, 538, 539, 540, 541, 542, 543, 544, 545. Uchlari mana hozir.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to warmly welcome you to what hopefully will be the most interesting panel discussion on the occasion of this excellent Tashkent International Investment Forum. We'll be talking about privatization. Privatization, yes, it's headaches, but mostly about the value that it brings for the development of the economy in Uzbekistan. Yesterday, we heard it from President Mirziyoyev that the country is more committed than ever to give space to private entrepreneurship, to attract foreign investment, and have a dominantly private sector-driven economic growth with very ambitious percentages also reflected there in His Excellency's statement with respect to private sector share in GDP to reach 80% in the coming 5 years. Now, one of the ways to attract foreign investment and one of the ways to reach this ambition is privatization. Today we have, of course I have an excellent panel with me. We have here Omonulo Nasreddin Hodjayev, who is First Deputy Minister of Finance. We have here Mr. Shukrat Vafayev, Deputy Minister of Investment and Foreign Trade. Mr. Beksot Usmanov, who is doing the privatization from Sama. We have, I can call him also even a friend, Prakash Kejriwal from Indorama, long-term friend and investor in this country. Shadab Khan, who would share us experience with recent privatization, and a fellow colleague, Munir Ferozi from IFC. We thought we would orchestrate it not as parallel statements. So I would be asking questions from the panelists, and we have different rounds. Of course, I will also manage the time so that you, our dear audience, you also have the opportunity to ask questions. And the panel would be both in English and in Uzbek, so get your headphones also ready for that. My first question would be about what today, in 2022, but also a bit of an outlook for 2023, what are the concrete plans of the government for privatization? Which are the large state-owned enterprises that are planned to be privatized in 2022, in 2023? And Omonulo, you are also a strategic thinker where you are. How do you select the privatization method and decide on stakes that are up for sale in the privatization process, taking into account the variety of sectors, some crown jewels, like the mining companies in Uzbekistan, utilities. We have been in close discussions about bank privatization. Give us, please, a bird's eye view on what you are planning to do, approaches to privatization this year and early next year.
Well, first of all, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending this panel discussion. Well, yesterday, President of Uzbekistan has clearly stated that privatization remains one of the most important priorities of Uzbekistan and takes a very big role, has a very big role in our reform agenda. So we've adopted a strategy of development in 2022-2026. Which clearly states that 80% weight of the private sector in the GDP is our clear objective for 2026. This can be achieved in a few ways. We could boost private sector, support more private sector development, but privatization is obviously one of the instruments that this objective is to be achieved. Apart from that, in a banking strategy that we are currently pursuing, banking sector reform strategy that we're currently pursuing, role of the private banks, of the private sector in the total assets of the banking system is being the current weight of the private banking system is 60%. This is an objective that we are pursuing. So our privatization objectives are set, so we understand what is the role of the private sector in the economy that we would like to achieve. And now it's a very good question, how are we planning to achieve this and how do we want to structure the privatization process? I'm sure we'll speak more about this during today's panel discussion. We had a very successful large privatization project finalized last year. And this was very much a project when we've tried to use best international practices on organizing the process and selecting the winner, and so buyer of this asset that I'm sure my colleagues will speak more in detail about. So to us, this was pretty much a learning exercise, which we believe was quite successful. As far as privatization process in general is currently organized, my colleague from the State Assets Management Agency will speak more in details about it, but privatization never stopped. So it has been happening over the last 2-3 years. And I'm sure Begzot will give more details on assets that were privatized during this period. This mostly included assets, it's either non-core assets by state-owned enterprises or assets where we clearly understand government, state should have no role, right? And this has been continued, this privatization effort. It's continued by a recent decree which was out 2 days ago, which clearly states that government is selling, I believe, more than 1,500 smaller assets, smaller real estate, stakes in companies. It will be selling it in the year 2022-2023. Apart from that, it includes also our initiatives related to taking some companies public. All right, so there'll be a specific, there is a specific deadlines when we will be taking some banks public. So answering your question on how we pick assets for privatization, I would like to respond by saying we are extremely, we take a very case-by-case approach. So it's every asset that we look at individually. So we are far from a far-away sale of state assets. We try to address this very pragmatically, and every asset that we are planning for privatization, and I'll speak about it more in detail in a minute, is to be privatized on the basis of a specific privatization strategy developed for every individual asset. So right now we are working on initiatives of privatizing larger scale assets. Well, it's not, you've mentioned about crown jewels. So crown jewels, they require a specific approach, but the rest, other assets as significant, not less significant than crown jewels, are also undergoing or will be undergoing the process of preparing specific, very tailor-made privatization strategy, whereby a specific method is to be selected. So what is the right mix between strategic sale and, say, taking company public? What is the right timing? What is the right stake? With an ultimate goal in mind of having private sector role in the GDP of 80%, bringing it up to 80%. I hope I answered your question.
I'm sure there will be more questions to you, including from the audience, but let me turn now to Mr. Vafayev. Shukrat, your ministry is in very regular contacts with potential foreign investors. One of your aims is to attract them. In your dialogue, privatization must have come up. What are the expectations of foreign investors? Are there particular sectors? How they are looking at the privatization process in Uzbekistan? What can you tell us about it?
Thank you, Joanna, for an interesting question. I, first of all, would like to thank all participants of today's discussion, my fellow panelists for attending and participating in this discussion, participating in our forum, and being interested in investments and privatization in Uzbekistan. In terms of sectors, I don't think we're different from any other country opening to international markets, opening to foreign investors. And you can see that there is a lot of interest to mineral resources, raw materials, industries, oil and gas, mining, where usually investors come first. Pretty much the same is happening here in Uzbekistan. We have a lot of people interested to start working in mining and oil and gas sector of Uzbekistan. But unlike other countries of former Soviet Union, we have much more diversified economy. So we also have investors who are interested in manufacturing, in textile, in services, in healthcare. So it's a pretty broad interest stimulated by rapid changes which happened in Uzbekistan and continue happening. And as it was clear from the yesterday's speech of our president, we, despite all challenges, will keep pushing reforms program forward, creating attractive environment for investors. Particular areas of interest for investors in terms of conditions or procedures or environment for them. Again, there is nothing unusual. Of course, they're all interested in macroeconomic stability. They all want to see what kind of tax regime they'll be facing in Uzbekistan. Are there any incentives available for them, and cost of labor, resources, availability of infrastructure. But along with that, there are a number of specific issues, areas where investors are particularly attentive and stress their efforts to receive sufficient comfort. It's first of all stability of the legal framework. We spent a lot of time explaining, despite the fact that we already stated as a country stability of law and legislation for investors in our law on investments. But this is still very much interesting and concerning area for investors. They want to have sufficient level of comfort in terms of stability of legislation over a reasonable period of time in order to comfortably invest in Uzbekistan. So to add them comfort, we reinforce all protection in this regard provided to investors through investment agreements. Another important area, of course, is enforceability of contracts, both with the government, with state organizations or institutions, and with partners they have here in Uzbekistan. And finally, I think the third area is the area of investment obligations. It is a tradition which was used in Uzbekistan in privatization process for a long time, when investor signs a special agreement which stipulates investment obligations he is expected to follow. And I believe we are moving gradually but steadily from very long, extensive investment obligations, which on one hand complicate investors' life clearly, because reduce flexibility of his operations and activities. On the other hand, it adds a lot of administrative cost and burden on the government organizations which are responsible for monitoring and following these investment obligations. So I hope that this particular part of our privatization process will continue rapidly and dynamically improving and will be providing assets to investors with clear understanding of their rights, obligations, and with any very limited interference of the state bodies in their activities post-privatization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shukrat. Next would be somebody who is actually doing the whole process. So, Bekzod, 2 questions to you because you deserve at least 2 questions. Number 1, please tell us, because you have already accumulated lessons learned from previous privatizations. Plus, we have read, but you can tell us more about the recent presidential decree of what is changing in the privatization process. I would not be complete with my question if I didn't ask you about the approach to valuation, which probably is one of the key issues investors are looking at. But tell us more about what changes in the process in terms of what you will tell us: data availability, transparency, overall approach, and of course the question that Omonulo seconded me on: what's in your pipeline for this year and early next year?
Во-первых, я очень извиняюсь, я продолжу свою речь на русском. Я хотел на узбекском, так как переводчика нету на русском. Вы правильно отметили, вот из вчерашней речи президента тоже можно уловить, что процессы приватизации очень важную роль играют в проводимых реформах сейчас. И явным примером считается принятое постановление президента по приватизации государственных объектов. Нужно отметить, что при подготовке этого постановления была организована инвентаризация всех пустующих государственных объектов, предприятий с госучастием, непрофильные государственные доли. То есть мы провели инвентаризацию и выявили там более 2000 государственных активов, которые необходимо приватизировать. И за исключением 500 объектов, социальных объектов, мы вот в перечень вошли 1500 государственных объектов и государственные доли предприятия с госучастием. И необходимо отметить, что вот эти предприятия поименно указаны, все госдоли, все государственные объекты поименно указаны. Вы правильно отметили, еще один новизна этого постановления – это продолжение опыта реализации государственных объектов без объявления стоимости этого объекта. У нас не было до этого опыта. С прошлого года мы начали этот опыт, этот путь прошел свою апробацию, и я считаю, это успешно прошел. Мы продали несколько государственных активов через этот метод. Это и Coca-Cola, это и несколько гостиниц мы продали. И мы сейчас работаем над приватизацией Фергана Азот, Дехканабад Кали завода, Хаят, гостиничный комплекс Хаят по этому методу. И постановлением обозначено, что мы будем продолжать реализацию государственных активов по этому методу. Что это значит? Это значит, мы без объявления стоимости объекта будем организовать торги, мы будем собирать из круг инвесторов публичные предложения, потом мы будем предлагать данные об этом объекте, то есть откроем доступ VDR, да, виртуальным дата-румом, а потом уже будем собирать уже чисто предложения по стоимости. То есть до этого, когда мы общались вместе с коллегами, была обозначена такая проблема, что до 2021 года мы реализовали государственных объектов с объявлением стоимости. Да, мы определяли стоимость. По большей мере, все объекты стояли на торгах, не продавались. Было принято несколько решений по автоматического снижения этой стоимости. Да? То есть это было решение по определению стоимости однобоким. Да? А сейчас мы уже изучаем, то есть привлекаем консультантов из большой четверки. Они изучают эту сферу, они изучают инвесторов, они собирают предложения из рынка, да? Вот за сколько оценивают инвесторы этот объект, а потом уже продаем. То есть как я говорил, этот метод уже показал себя из хорошей стороны, и мы будем продолжать реализовать государственные объекты через этот метод. Помимо этого, в решении постановления было даны такие, как сказать, право и условия для того, чтобы улучшить инвестиционную ситуацию, улучшить условия для реализации гособъектов. Это что? Это дается право, вы все знаете, что с прошлого года внедрена новая система работы помощников, хакимов на местах. Да? Вот для этих помощников мы даем право, постановлением дается право выявлять государственные объекты, пустующие объекты, и без никаких решений, без принятия решения выдать заявки, и по этим заявкам мы будем уже работать по реализации этого объекта. Еще есть моменты, когда, вы знаете, я уже говорил, что мы инвентаризировали более 60 министерств, ведомств и более 12 тысяч предприятий с госучастием на предмет присутствия непрофильных активов или пустующих объектов. Да? Если какой-то объект, если какое-то помещение, принадлежащее этим предприятиям, министерствам, ведомствам, будет пустовать более 3 месяцев, по предложению вот этих помощников мы будем продавать эти объекты или передать в аренду без согласования с этим министерством, ведомством или предприятиями. То есть это тоже очень большой шаг. Еще один момент, если я говорил, что мы привлекаем инвестиционных и консультантов для приватизации гособъектов из большой четверки. Если поступающее предложение от инвесторов будет более 10 миллионов долларов, эти консультанты без согласования с нами или без согласования продавца, они могут сами продавать этим инвесторам. То есть все вот эти процессы. Еще один момент я хотел упомянуть, что в прошлом году вышел закон о приватизации земельных участков, земельных участков для предпринимательства и градостроительства. Да? И этот вопрос годами нас тревожило. Не было ответов на эти вопросы. И в прошлом году В ноябре месяце был принят закон, в этом году был принят постановление Кабинета министров, и мы будем продавать эти земельные участки через онлайн аукционные платформы. Сейчас готовится вот эта платформа новая, которая все ведомства, они в автоматическом режиме должны согласовать процедуры согласования этих земельных участков. И я могу сказать, что до середины этого года нам поручено поставить на аукцион более 50 тысяч земельных участков с территории более 2000 гектаров. Помимо этого, вот Оман Олеке тоже сказал, что приватизационные процессы последние годы можно увидеть, что идут через капитальные рынки капитала, да, через IPO, через SPO. Было принято несколько решений президента, которые обозначено ряд крупных предприятий. Я могу даже сказать не крупные, а градообразующие, отраслеобразующие предприятия, банки, финансовые институты. Да, часть вот этих акций, этих предприятий пойдут на IPO и SPO. Помимо этого еще нужно сказать, что вы правильно сказали, что открытость и публичность – это залог успешной приватизации. И мы стараемся, да, и в этом методе, который мы хотим применять, и те методы, которые мы уже применяем, да, продажу через e-аукцион, продажу через фондовую биржу, это говорит о том, что все торги, они идут открыто и прозрачно. И еще один момент, постановлением президента, которое было принято 18 марта, вот на прошлой неделе, говорится, что заявки по покупке государственных активов, продающие через государственные энергокомиссии, подаются через e-аукцион. То есть мы не будем, мы уже с прошлого года применяем этот опыт, но мы будем уже расширять этот опыт. То есть мы получаем все заявки через электронную площадку, открываем эти электронные площадки и ставим процесс в YouTube, в социальные сети. То есть все вот эти процессы будут диджитализированы, да? И еще один момент, еще один хороший, я бы сказал, для успешной приватизации нам нужно успешно проводить трансформацию государственных предприятий. Мы начали это с 2020 года совместно с Министерством финансов, совместно с Министерством экономики, с привлечением международных финансовых институтов. Да? Это привлечение зарубежных менеджеров, это внедрение лучшей корпоративной системы, лучшего корпоративного управления, это внедрение систем комплайенса, это назначение или выбор независимых членов наблюдательного совета. И у нас есть таргет для этого. До 2025 года мы должны довести долю независимых членов наблюдательного совета до 30%. У нескольких крупных предприятий мы предприятия перевели свои финансовый отчет на международную финансовую отчетность. Несколько предприятий взяли кредитные рейтинги, которые тоже показывают открытость и прозрачность деятельности этих предприятий. И я могу еще сказать, что это постановление не единственный документ. Мы подготовили еще проект указа президента, который сейчас рассматривается и где предусмотрены те нормы, которые обеспечат равные конкурентные условия для предпринимателей, для частного сектора и улучшение управления предприятиями с госучастием. То есть вот эти все меры, которые делаются, это показывает старание и показывает отношение правительства, президента к этим вопросам. То есть то отношение, которое сейчас проявляет и президент, и правительство, это поддерживает ускоренную приватизацию для успешного и эффективного управления государственных предприятий. Я могу еще сказать много о приватизационных процессах, но если будут вопросы, я готов. Спасибо.
Благодарю вас. I'm certain that there will be more questions to you. Now, before the panel, we were discussing, of course, issues like how to attract the best investors for privatization, and we were briefly discussing of how to avoid footloose investors that are opportunistic. Now, the next question is to somebody who's definitely not footloose. Indorama has been present in Uzbekistan for a long time. And Prakash, you also have long-term plans for this country. You have also expressed interest in acquiring some of the assets in this country, and I know that you're still interested. How are you looking at the privatization process as we speak about it in March 2022? And how do you combine it, appetizing assets and investment conditions? What would be your views?
Thanks, Susanna. Thank you very much. In fact, I would rather mention that we are not looking, but we have already started investing. And we are one of the first companies to have participated and acquired 100% divestment in a chemical industry. And early this morning, in a panel which I was attending, I presented how, as a private investor, having acquired a privatized asset, how we transformed it. And today, we acquired in 2019, we invested $50 million, we completely turned it around, and today that asset produces, world-class quality, almost 250,000 tons of fertilizers with best footprints of health, safety, environment, operational health, safety, and which benefits the farmers, the community, and all the other stakeholders. So that's what our long-term view with any privatization assets that we participate in. I would be very keen to share a few points, actually, since I know that the President yesterday mentioned that the government is very keen to privatize, and this long list of assets which will be privatized, and there's a process which will be followed. I think what would be important is that each of the privatization assets should have to some degree a defined time frame to complete the transaction, because that keeps the interest of the investors and potential investors alive. Because if a decision to privatize a particular asset keeps on getting postponed year after year, good investors will lose interest ultimately. The second aspect, and I'm glad Mr. Wafai brought this point earlier today, that the investment obligations to the investors, that should be done away with. Because once the investor buys an asset, he values the asset for the commercial value of that asset. He has a plan of what he wants to do with this asset. And so there should be no prescription to say that the investor has to operate an asset in a particular way, has to produce certain things in a particular way, or that asset should be treated like a social object to create social employment. then ultimately the private investor will also fail in the long term if he does that. So that's a kind of something which, and I'm glad that the government's already thinking in that direction, so which is very, very important. Another point which I think is relevant is that if you have decided, if the government has decided to privatize an asset, and I'm talking about large-sized assets, then it will be prudent not to make any new investments in those assets by the government, except for regular investment for upkeep and maintenance. Because what would happen that an asset which has been decided for privatization, and if you make new investments, you are only adding the cost to the investor, because that investor may not be interested in that new investment. He would have done that new investment in a different way, in a more efficient way. He would have different technology in his mind. So, it would be prudent not to do that. And another point which would be important is that as assets in different sectors are being privatized, it's important that there's a complete disconnect between the state's interest in that sector and the investment by the state in this sector where the private investors are being brought in. Otherwise, there'll be a conflict of interest, because if the policy makers or the people who are responsible for framing the policies have a commercial interest in that sector, then there'll be always conflicting, and that will not attract the investors. So that's one more important point which I would want to bring forward. And of course, what is important is that for assets like geological assets, it would be good if those assets are privatized with a view, and I know the government is very keen always to have value addition, value chain creation and all that. So those assets are privatized in a way where an investor presents a program of value addition, a value creation. Otherwise, what would happen is that those assets would be invested just for resource mining, resource stripping, which is not good in the long run for the country. And the last point I would make is that when an investor comes in emerging market, like a frontier country like Uzbekistan, he's not fully aware of the dynamics of the country. He's interested in the asset, but he's not fully aware of the dynamics of the country. So it will be very, very important that the government facilitates a structure of single window, hand-holding, because it's a mirage, it's a complex situation. And that will really encourage, because if the investor knows that, yes, I have government by my side, not just to sell the asset, but also to take me through, handhold me and tell me how to ride it, how to take it forward. And there should be a regular interaction between the investors who have already been in the country, who has already invested, bought over, participated, to listen to them, what are the issues they're having, so that jointly they can work out and the government will come out with some resolutions to help and create a more positive environment. And I'm sure with all this that I have mentioned from my own understanding of the country since 2010, which Indorama has been investing, and I must say that over the last 12 years or so, we have invested almost $700 million in various sectors in the country, and certainly with support of IFIs like ABRD and IFC, and both the colleagues are here, and must thank you for actively participating with us in the process. Thank you.
Well, it has been an honor for us. I think I can speak on behalf of IFC as well, to have been your partner. And yes, I did visit the Kokand fertilizer plant to see what value has been created since the acquisition. Moving to Coca-Cola, and again, the two questions, unsurprisingly, would be, one, about your experience with the privatization process. I was here at this very Congress hall when you signed the privatization deal, and perhaps to pick up one of the many points Prakash has made about what I call the post-sale customer care. So the single window, because there are the investment obligations. Prakash mentioned investor may not necessarily be familiar with the dynamics. You still have issues. What is your view, Sharab, on what you went through, what you can share? I always say that, again, the first stop of any potential investor is with you and with Indorama and others to check the dynamics of the country. What are your messages to potential investors, and how you see this post-privatization kind of customer-investor care? And of course, I will get back to Shukrat and Omonulu about these issues.
Thanks, Anna. Firstly, let me just start by saying thank you for the opportunity for us to be present here and to share our experience. First, just to kind of second what both Minister Amanullah and Mr. Bezod were talking about, from a process standpoint, as the Coca-Cola company, we have been very impressed with the way the overall process was run. It was international, first. From the get-go, the kind of work that both Sama and the Ministry of Finance did in ensuring the right partners are brought in, whether it was Rothschild as the investment banker or Denton's as a legal, or the Big Four from an auditing standpoint, I think that really set the stage to ensure that it was fair, transparent, and more importantly, equitable for everybody who was there. And the benefit of having an experienced investment banker and an experienced Big Four in the process was also that valuation, something you alluded to earlier on, got taken care of at a very fundamental stage of the overall process. And that, coupled with the process that Mr. Bezod mentioned, which is an open bidding, ensured that everybody was aware, it was transparent, it was, at every stage there was constant communication that was done, and ensured that, not just, within the ministries and within the government, but also the public at large was indicated as to what was happening through the process. Because like in every other situation, there are obviously multiple points of view when you're privatizing anything, right? And at the end of the day, there were very different perspectives on whether we should privatize Coca-Cola or not privatize Coca-Cola. All I can say is I think at the end of the process, at a $252 million valuation for the asset, the government was happy with the way the process was run, as an open bidding, because it was competed till the last stage, right? So it showed interest, it showed that investors were willing to make a bet on Uzbekistan and the growth opportunity here. It was a good situation for the investors because they saw that this was a transparent process. They saw that they had an opportunity to, with the right mindset and the right investment potential, that they can continue to build on the opportunity here. And I think the biggest winner, in my mind, is the consumer of Uzbekistan, right? From a government standpoint, they don't need to be taking care of something that was non-core in any ways, for them. But more importantly, as we now privatize the business and look at the future opportunity with the new investments coming in, with the new categories that we are looking to do, the real winner is the consumer. Yes, the government now makes, taxes, everybody else wins, but for me, that's the real takeaway, that the consumer benefits at the end of the day. And alluding to what, again, you highlighted and Prakash was speaking about, I think it's a very important process for the privatization process, not just to be the event itself. It is really critical for the government to then if not handhold, at least provide a single window, through the process itself. The post-care is as important as the operation itself. There is this saying in South Asia saying, operation successful, patient died, is not necessarily a recipe for success. I'm not alluding to us. We are, touchwood, doing very well, and there has been continued growth post-privatization as well. But I think what would be really useful, even for not just us, but for other investors as well, is there are obviously teething issues that happen, as we go through the process. And as the system is new, having somebody who can then, from either the SAMA end or from the Ministry of Investment and Foreign Trade end, having somebody as that touch point for that investor to take things forward really is going to be beneficial in the long run. Also alluding to another point that Prakash made in his conversation, I think one thing I give credit for, again, to the Uzbek government in the way they ran our process is the openness that they had with the investors. For example, there were critical investments that were going on that were openly and transparently discussed with the investors in the bidding process, saying these are what we are looking at doing. These are, sustenance-related investments. These are capital-related investments. Do you want us to continue? And I think that truly is credit to Sama and the government of Uzbekistan, that they had that foresight and they had that, gumption to be able to go out and share that. And like all investors, the investors were okay with the sustenance-related investments that were going, and they said, let's reevaluate some of the capital investments post-privatization. And I can tell you, in hindsight, that was the single best decision that as an investor, that really happened. Because post that, in Q4, we could change things to do, and we could really fast-track some of the investments that were needed. And again, happy to share that that process ensured that we could make and bring to market some things that we needed to do at a much faster pace than otherwise. So overall, I would say from a Coca-Cola standpoint, the process has been very, very transparent, has been very open, and kudos to everybody in Sama and the government of Uzbekistan in making that happen, and strongly, strongly advocate a single window, post-purchase, customer care, if that's the word, coming from a consumer goods piece. That would be really helpful for an investor as they move forward.
If you don't mind, Shoshana.
Manolo, please.
Well, in M&A transactions, every project has a code name. So this one was called Project Chimgan. Once this, I just realized, as Shadab Khan was speaking, I just realized that once this Project Chimgan was over, we never got to, well, apart from not celebrating it, but we never got to really discuss, so it's great to feel this Coca-Cola vibe back. So it's in almost about half a year. So it's all this, memories of this project, which sometimes was fascinating, sometimes was challenging. Well, it's a very important point on hand-holding. So I get it, Shadab Khan. So let's look at it if there's a still need. Very good, very important point on need for the onboarding of new investors, which I'm sure my colleagues are taking care of, and we are also happy to participate.
Thank you very much. Shukrat, would you like to add something before I turn to our colleague from IFC, Munir, about this post-purchase customer care? Because you, again, you're serving as the single window for new investors. Is it something that, again, post-privatization, investors could come to you? I mean, not personally to you, you have a lot to do, but to the Ministry of Investment of Foreign Trade. How would you, what is in your head, how you would like to see this kind of post-purchase customer care for foreign investors, onboarding them, as Omanulo called it? Sorry if I took you off guard.
No, definitely it's a very important issue, and sometimes attracting investors is probably easy, relatively, but ensuring that these investors expand their presence in Uzbekistan or in any other country very much depends on their successful operations in the first years in the country. And as usually happens in any emerging market or in any new for you market, there are numerous issues which arise, and you need support, you need explanation, you need some advice. And of course, the idea of a single window, it's a very good one. And it's probably the first thing which comes to mind. But from our experience, it's not as easy to do as say, because first of all, you need to have capable staff in your unit which works with investors. In our case, it's our direct foreign investments agency. Second, this staff should keep updated on all changes happening, and changes happen every day in Uzbekistan, so sometimes they lag behind. And third, I believe the concerns and issues which investors bring to the agency should be reflected back, sent back to other colleagues in other government agencies, so they know and understand and appreciate what are the issues which are raised usually by investors. So we're trying to organize the work and activities of our agency in this particular way. Partially successful, still a lot of room for improvement. We'll be working on that.
Thank you very much. Now to us, international financial institutions and our wisdom to be shared. EBRD ourselves, we have been supporting SAMA, helped draft state ownership policy, contributed to capacity building, reviewing privatization laws, and I think both of us, we are also there for what I would like to return to pre-privatization financing. Shaba, you were cautioning against CapEx, pre-privatization, but we can revert to it. With Omonulo, we are discussing also bank privatizations, and with you, any type of additional assistance to entities. Yes, there's an echo, sorry, Shukrat. What is your takeaway? I mean, I would hasten to add that, of course, we shall also be promoters of the good news about Uzbekistan's privatization process. In 2 months' time, we'll have EBRD's annual meeting in Marrakesh, and I know Uzbekistan would like to have an investment session, so as much audience as we can attract will be there. We'll be organizing a Central Asia Investment Forum in Tokyo on the 1st of December, another opportunity. So we'll take the good word all around, and of course, I very much hope that with you yourselves, we shall soon have the first plenary meeting of the Foreign Investors Council, also to address some of the kind of major issues to help take the reform forward. But Munir, over to you. How IFC is helping with the privatization process, you are up to here, providing assistance, but any kind of lessons from what you have seen so far during the privatization process? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Susanna. First of all, it's very, very difficult speaking after 6 panelists who are of this caliber. So let me try and do some justice to it. When I was thinking about this panel last night, and I was thinking, you know, what are the 3 words that come to my mind as I come to Uzbekistan? You know, and we do a lot on PPPs, and we are starting on the privatization. And the 3 words that came to me were energizing, progressive, dynamic, and maybe if I can also add reformist. And I think that environment, I was here 6 months ago. We were congratulating the government of Uzbekistan on the tremendous progress they had done. But 6 months later, let me just maybe take a stock of what we have achieved in the last 6 months. Today, Mr. Wafayev just signed the 1,600 megawatt CCGT Sirdarya. And I take PPPs and privatization in the same vein, right? PPPs are more greenfield, privatizations are brownfield. We are in the market to launch a 500 megawatt tender for a solar PV plant. Again, both of them advised by IFC, but then let me not do injustice to EBRD and ADB as well. The Namangan project has been bid out, and then the commercial close of 100 megawatt wind has been done as well. So that's a lot. And 4 o'clock today, we are also signing another 1 gigawatt of solar mandate. So that's really shows the interest of the private sector, and the private sector does not just walk in because there is a pipeline of projects. They walk in because the environment, as has been mentioned, is good. They walk in because the government is committed. They walk in because there is a partnership, and they are listening to the investors. So again, I think I don't need to repeat what has been repeated in the day and a half in terms of why is this a destination of investment and why is this a destination of choice for investors. Some of the things I think both Prakash and Shadab mentioned quite well in terms of what their experience is. But as we move on to the privatization program, which is quite an ambitious program, right? 1,500 assets, fairly aggressive timeline. And the experience, whilst we've had successes on both Indorama as well as Coca-Cola and the bank, has been limited on the privatization. So we really need to look at how do we ramp up this privatization process. Some of the points that have been made by the investors, particularly on the one-stop shop window and making sure that it's sort of defined timeline are excellent points. But let me just maybe say from an advisor's perspective, as we start out the privatization program, and we are engaged on the chemicals privatization as well, and we are looking forward to playing a bigger role in the future assets. So maybe 4 or 5 points. I won't call it wisdom, but my experience, right? First and foremost, I think there is always a tendency to put very prescriptive deadlines and say, we need to do this, and we need to do this by X, Y, Z date. I think we should do away with that by balancing it with sufficient preparation, because the preparation that you do upfront actually cuts out the timeline later. So very, very important that the preparation is done, and actually all the investors are on equal pace in terms of having that transparent process, right? In terms of showing that, you know, that your data room has actually been populated with proper due diligence. So that's one thing. Second thing is obviously the adoption of a strong and bankable framework to make sure that the rights and obligations are clearly described in the SPA. Third, again, a lot of people talked about it, to make sure there's the selection of the investor is transparent and it's not prejudiced, right? You're not favoring one bidder over the other. It should be non-discriminatory, clear, and objective process. Fourth, I personally believe that the valuation should be done up front. You know, there's a tendency to basically say the valuation can be done later on, but the valuation needs to be done up front. I'm not sure that we need to disclose the valuation, but within the government, there should be some benchmark in terms of what this asset is worth. Otherwise, you know, you may be disappointed when the investor put in the offer. And I think one thing that has not been discussed, and I'd like to really, really bring it for a discussion over here, particularly from Shadab and Prakash, is the environmental and social aspects of the privatization. You know, a lot of SOEs are overstaffed. And we need to make sure that the private sector has a hand in terms of making sure there's an optimization of the labor force, as well as there is a fair treatment of, you know, if there is a redundancy involved, and there's a communication around that. So I think that is a very important aspect, and some of the assets, particularly the chemicals privatization, you have legacy environmental issues. That needs to be looked at pre-privatization to see what is the mitigation around that, right? What are the costs of that mitigation? And what's the risk allocation around that? You know, in terms of legacy issues, is the government gonna basically make sure that those legacy issues are covered so that the private sector has a clean slate in terms of those issues? Those will be 4 or 5 key success factors, as I see it, as we advise the government in terms of, you know, privatization that one needs to look at.
Thank you very much, Munir. May I pick up 3 issues, and then I'm asking for volunteers before we turn to the audience. One, let us not deny that the situation is slightly different versus last year. I can use euphemism, but there's a complex situation out there. I would like to ask you, especially my Uzbek partners, how do you feel, what impact it may have on the investors' pool that you are targeting? What is it that on your mind? Again, privatization commitment has been reconfirmed. Presidential decree gives not only the green light, but improves the overall conditions, but how do you see this situation? Number 2, yes, Omonulo, I would like you to tell us a bit more about bank privatizations. How do you see that going forward? Again, it's a different animal, bank privatizations overall. Also, we have been discussing, as I mentioned, pre-privatization financing. And the third one was actually something that Munir picked up. One thing is from investor perspective of how you look at legacy issues, including labor restructuring today in Uzbekistan, but also environmental legacy issues. These are 3 things that I have on my mind, and I'm very happy to take any volunteers who would like to address these issues. Omonula, I already volunteered you at least on the state-owned bank privatizations, if I may.
Well, I can address the first 2, I believe, but Mr. Bafayev would need to compliment me on this, on the first one. So I don't think we should be fooling ourselves by saying there's no impact of current geopolitical situation on us, right? And both of us, Zuzana, know who else was supposed to be sitting in this panel, and and why it's not happening. I mean, it's happening, but this person is not here. So this is inevitable that we are impacted, and obviously we would need to take this into consideration. Do we think it will be a game changer? No, we don't. We believe this would need to be factored into our plans and would require more effort, and I think we can manage our way around those problems. So I think, again, I mean, the message is that, yes, we are impacted, but yeah, we'll just work more. Well, as far as bank privatization is concerned, well, this has been undergoing for quite some time by now. And it's very, organic process of transforming banks with subsequent privatization. And well, so you well know, you're very, actively involved with banking system. You well know that all banks are pursuing transformation programs, which for now includes pretty basic things. Banks are by far more advanced transformation-wise than SOEs. We should admit this. So one bank is currently in the privatization process, which we expect to be sort of brought to some final decision shortly. And two more banks are coming up for privatization still this year, as set out in presidential decree that my colleagues have referred to. Well, I believe we can name those banks. It's public, so it's Promstroy Bank and Asaka. Both Promstroy Bank, which is being in the process of transformation for quite some time by now with help of IFC, with now involvement of EBRD and ADB. And we believe they have a very good chance for the successful privatization project. So both banks, process-wise, so we're sort of trying to be realistic. There was a very good point about deadlines that are sometimes ambitious. Well, this is reality. We do operate under the ambitious deadlines. So I believe everybody who deals with us knows this very well. So deadlines are ambitious. But for these banks, we are taking into account that banks, as you've rightly pointed out, is a different animal, right? And might require more time. So we are aiming at starting process this year. So they'll be sort of worked on beginning still this year. As far as other banks are concerned, as I've referred to in the beginning, well, there's a banking strategy which holds, which is being followed. And in fact, these two banks are being privatized this year is within the framework of the current strategy that we're pursuing. We have a clear indications on how we will proceed on other banks, both in terms of taking them public, I mean, having an IPO of those banks on the local market, and also in terms of strategic sale. So as it's set out in our strategy, by the year 2025, we will be, we expect that government's share in the total assets of the banking system will be not more than 40%, with only 4 banks remaining as government-owned banks for policy reasons, right? So we know about those 4 banks. The rest of the banking system will be privatized. And this is our plan that we are working on. You've rightly mentioned out that banks are different animals. So they do require not, say, in a contrast to SOEs, banks require a little bit more than a simple prettying up with a subsequent sale. So banks require more, work on their portfolios, some sometimes very painful findings that we have that are to be dealt with. So we understand this well, especially given the experience that we have now gathered from our transactions with banks. But we realize that it requires specific, very kind of, as I said, tailor-made approach. However, we spoke about SOEs earlier. SOEs and why you may think we are being slower with SOEs than expected. Just like banks, some key SOEs, they require structural reforms to be pursued prior to privatization, prior to successful privatization, right? So we have to deal with tariff reform. We have to deal with, you've mentioned utilities, so it's something that has to do with unbundling of those companies. So it's a whole range of issues we have to deal with before we put up everything for sale. But going back to banks, our agenda for banks holds, and and all the deadlines are set. They are ambitious but doable. We believe so, and well, it's work in progress.
Well, we hope to be with you during this work in progress and take it to the very end.
We hope to.
Shukrat, anything to add? Because you have your fingers on the pulse of potential foreign investors. What about the impact of the current situation? You have been here also at this investment forum. How much the investor pool has narrowed, or how much the interest has actually increased in light of what Uzbekistan has achieved for the last couple of years?
Well, a difficult question, the question which concerns everybody on a vast territory now, if not everywhere in the world. The situation between our largest trading partner and Ukraine, of course, created a lot of challenges for us. And the channels of transmission of this external shock are well known. It's remittances, export markets, additional logistical challenges, and increase of cost of commodities. But it's probably, so we immediately identified all these challenges. It's not a rocket science. We immediately developed our remedial measures, how to facilitate economy, how to facilitate enterprises, private, state-owned, how to facilitate transactions. So we are comfortably confident that we can overcome, at least in the short run, these new challenges. And I would always remember what our president said on 15th of November of 2019, when we had first person infected by COVID in Uzbekistan. His Excellency President told, look, the situation changed, the world is different. We have to learn how to live in these conditions and environment. And we started learning next day, and I think did much better than other countries. The same approach will be applied here. I'm not trying to be over-optimistic, but we are confident that we can deal with these challenges with diversified economy and experts, with sizable buffers on monetary and fiscal front. So nothing dramatic, extra work and extra effort is required. In terms of investors, well, the presence of so many people here suggests that at least interest to Uzbekistan grows and is set to grow further, inshallah. And probably some investors who were looking at the region will decide to move now or come to Uzbekistan rather to any other country in the region. And one part of the thinking of them could be related to the events between Ukraine and Russia. Overall, we hope that this will be resolved soon, and we'll start back to normal operations and functions and cooperation at this big and important for us market. Thank you.
This is the time for you to ask questions. I don't know whether we have roving microphones.
Zana, I just wanted to address one other thing that you...
Apologies. I took the floor from my own panelists.
I'll actually take the
please.
third point which Murli
Yes.
mentioned, and I'll, and it's coming from my own experience in what we participated in the other privatization program that we mentioned. So there are two aspects, environmental and social. And of course, it's very important to have a mitigation plan for legacy environmental issue, because a new investor doesn't want to be taken for a ride for something which has been done in past, because he has not done it. So my thought is that, and in many other countries, that's the process which is adopted, is to have a baseline at the asset transfer time, that this is the baseline at which various contaminations has happened, particularly if you're a chemical asset or something like that. And the obligation on the new investor is that he does not make the baseline worse off. So that's where the penalty kicks in, and that's how it works out. And of course, he should be encouraged to improve the baseline, so which is basically a kind of a bonus in a sense. And as far as the social aspects are concerned, particularly with respect to employment, a lot of assets, and particularly in the chemical sphere, because that's which we are normally monitoring, has overemployment, if you call it. And when we acquired the chemical asset that we are currently running, and I'll give you some numbers. At that point of time, at the time of acquisition, we had about 450 employees, and the plant was not running efficiently at that point of time. Yeah, and we understood that more than 100 over employees were something called home-based employees. So they were called when the plant was running. They will put on. So there was employment, but there was not real employment. Yeah. So that was something like that. And then it should be looked at in terms of number of man hours. You may have 1,000 employees, but that 1,000 employees are putting how many man hours? Because otherwise you just have them on a payroll, but they're not really contributing to the man hours. So they're not really taking home wages as much as they should be on a sustainable employment. And in fact, after we took over, that 425, which had almost 100 home employees, we have grown it to more than 500 actually, because we have expanded further, we have grown it further, but we have made it more sustainable. So this is long-term sustainable employment. So I would think here where there's a situation of redundancies, let the investor manage it. There's a framework of law on retrenchments, on benefits to be given on retrenchments. Let the investor factor in that cost. Say, for example, an asset which the government is privatizing, and there's probably 1,000 payrolls which are redundant. Let the investor factor in the cost of that redundancy and see how he'll handle it. What will be the cost of retrenchments and other benefits, and what program does he want to bring for livelihood restoration or re-employment or redeployment. So instead of putting a condition on investor to say that, no, you have to continue with the existing payroll, to let him decide how he manages it best. Thank you.
And just to second what Prakash was talking of, one, on behalf of our bottling partner Coca-Cola Ichicek, I am proud to say that we haven't had any attrition, outside of the natural attrition that happens post the takeover as well. And one of the big pieces that we are actually consciously investing in over the short term is upskilling, because a lot of the similar when the takeover happened with 1,700 associates on the plant, a lot of the real need really was to kind of upskill and move them into areas that are actually useful for the organization and useful for them as they move forward. Because again, nobody wants disguised employment or underemployment either. So that's been a conscious area that as a bottling partner, Coca-Cola Ichicek has taken on, and with a very clear commitment to the team that we will focus on your development and how that development can then bring back value to the organization itself. The other aspect around environment, and I think it's as Coca-Cola, one of the privileges, I guess, of being in an organization like this is we have had very strong baseline and very strong monitoring of everything. So as our plant was there, every single piece was monitored or measured. And in fact, with the new investor, we've actually tightened the screws and said you have to do significantly better than that on a lot of the environmental parameters. So we may be in a privileged position, some of the other investors maybe not, but these are things that as investors consciously, we take that into consideration, build it into the plans. It was part of the privatization process itself, and part of the original deck, by the way, that Sama pulled together when they did. So it's therefore part of plan may not have been discussed otherwise. Thank you.
I'll just, Susanna, I'll just take the liberty to add one more point, which is very interesting, is that when we took over Kokand superphosphate, one of the key issues for us was to improve the environmental footprints. And we, in fact, almost 25% of our modernization capex went towards just environmental footprints, which is very significant for an asset program like that. And today, proudly, I can say that the stacks and the scrubber systems that we have built, you can see birds perching on the stacks. So it shows the air emission is completely zero. We have created a biodiversity centers where tens of thousands of birds have made their habitat. So you can imagine in a chemical campus, you have a biodiversity where tens of thousands of birds have made their habitat. We'll speak for the footprints of environmental compliance and the benchmark we have set for ourselves.
Я бы тоже хотел пару слов, если можно.
Обязательно. May I add just two things, because I would be interested in your views on that. So one is the environmental legacy baseline. The other one is the social contract. So who manages the workforce? May I add two things, because I look forward to hearing from you. One that I have noticed is also access to raw material. So when companies, and I have just met one, the mine is a separate asset from the underlying company, how it might be taken into account, because investors will be looking at. And something which often considered a fringe issue is your communication strategy. Because privatization is as good as you have good investors, but also as much as you can sell it to the constituencies, the public, the local community, what is privatization about, what the benefits are, how. So communication strategy is, I believe, is extremely important. Because again, family silver, who got the assets. So if you could address these four issues, I think then we shall have a lot of questions in the lobbies. But Vexo, the floor is to you.
John, before Bigzo takes the floor, I would very much appreciate if you release me, because you're in the good hands of this
Do you have a photo
professional
session
guys, and I have another arrangement, unfortunately. However interesting this discussion, I have to run to another one.
Thank you very much, Shukrat. Over to you, Vexo.
Спасибо. Прежде чем ответить на ваш вопрос, я бы хотел сделать несколько комментариев на слова господина Каржеваля и господина Фирузи. Во-первых, я хотел бы сказать спасибо, огромное спасибо за такой интерес, за такое консультации, советы для того, чтобы провести хорошую, успешную приватизацию. И те случаи, которые были выше названы, это случаи, это опыт. Опыт могут быть и успешные, и могут быть провальные, но мы все должны провести это, почувствовать этот опыт, провести через себя. Да? И когда мы увидим, что нам нужно сделать, мы обязательно будем делать. Насчет комментария по присвоению каких-то обязательств при приватизации. Да? У нас, если вы помните, до прошлого года был опыт такой реализации государственных активов по нулевой стоимости, по стоимости 1 сумм с инвестиционными обязательствами. Да? Мы потихоньку отходим от того метода, когда при продаже присваиваются еще какие-то обязательства. То есть вот эти отмена продажи активов по нулевой, по стоимости 1 сумм — это первые шаги. То есть мы отходим от присвоения каких-то инвестиционных обязательств. По социальным обязательствам это тяжелый вопрос. Я понимаю, вот у нас обычно, когда приватизируются большие заводы, у них много численности работников, много каких-то социальных обязательств. Но я думаю, что нужно отрегулировать все эти процессы через нормотворчество, да, определить какие-то правила игры, чтобы всем это было понятно. По временным срокам я полностью согласен, когда ставятся какие-то обязательства, должны быть временные сроки, да, и мы последнее время это и ставим. То есть если имеются какие-то обязательства по сохранению работников, мы ставим этот год, 2 года, да. Но вы тоже должны понять, что в процессе проведения ускоренной приватизации могут быть такие опыты, да, и я хочу, чтобы все инвесторы, которые инвестируют в Узбекистан, участвуют в приватизации, они давали свои комменты, да, какие-то улучшающие комментарии, улучшающие существующих условий. Да. Мы тесно работаем с международными финансовыми компаниями. Вы знаете, сейчас мы работаем над проектами законов, которые нас консультируют международные финансовые институты. Это закон об управлении госимуществом, это закон о приватизации в новой редакции, это закон о банкротстве в новой редакции. То есть те нормы, которые сейчас разрабатываются, внедряются, это из того опыта, из нашего опыта, из международного опыта. То есть мы хотим, чтобы эта площадка в Узбекистане, инвестиционная ситуация была привлекательной для инвесторов и для зарубежных, и для местных. Поэтому, когда у вас будут комментарии, когда у вас будут какие-то советы, мы всегда открыты, мы всегда с пониманием относимся с таким комментарием. И спасибо. По вашим вопросам, по объектам коммуникации, да? То есть я хочу сказать, что эти процессы приватизации, они последние годы ускорились, и мы не будем останавливаться на полпути. Мы будем приватизировать, мы будем дальше идти. У нас есть таргет, да, уменьшить в 3 раза государственную долю в экономике до 2025 года. Но есть такие моменты, где нам необходима консультация, международная консультация. Да? И когда мы будем приватизировать гигантов, мы нуждаемся в этих консультациях. Да? Мы должны определить стратегию, как мы будем приватизировать, кому будем приватизировать, каким путем будем приватизировать, через фондовую биржу или через M&A. То есть мы будем привлекать консультантов, стратегических партнеров. Мы уже привлекаем международные финансовые корпорации, да, в продаже Ферганазут. да, как стратегического консультанта. Помимо стратегического консультанта будет еще работающий консультант, еще будет оценочная компания, но стратегический консультант, они покажут нам путь, как это сделать правильно. Поэтому в коммуникациях, по объектам коммуникации я тоже могу сказать, что уже ведутся работы по реализации некоторых объектов этой отрасли. Да, еще вот подсказывает Аманаляке, у нас есть стратегия, коммуникационная стратегия, и мы будем, конечно же, мы будем действовать по тем нормам, по тем мерам, определенным в имеющих стратегиях.
Спасибо огромное. I think that we have reached the end of this session. I hope that we provoked further interest as much as further clarifications have been provided and some messages also shared from the representatives of the investor community. I would like to thank the panelists very much for their contribution, and of course they are available, they are accessible for further advice and communication, as you said. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Zuzana.